Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, folks. This is session 3 of our study on the life of David. We want to apologize. Last night when we were live streaming this, last night on Wednesday night, we had some technical difficulties, and the live stream didn't work. And then we thought, well, we'll at least put up the recording. Well, the sound wasn't good and wasn't right on the recording, so we put that up and then took it down. All that to say, this is third time's a charm. And we believe now we are going to be able to put this up online for everybody who was hoping to be a part of this Bible study. So welcome. If you're watching us live, we actually are live right now. We didn't warn anybody, but we're live right now. But this is going to be taped and then put on the internet on YouTube and Facebook. So welcome. We're glad you're a part of our study today. And we're going to dig into the next part of the saga of David. And over the last couple of sessions, we've looked at where David came from. We started, of course, with the fact that Israel didn't have a king, all during the period called the period of the Judges. And then we come to the book of 1 Samuel, and Samuel is really the last of the judges. He's also a prophet and a priest. And he hears the people cry out to him, "We want a king. We want to be like all the other nations." God is not terribly pleased with that. He says, I'm supposed to be the king. It's supposed to be God is the king of this country. But the people wanted a human king like the other countries, and so God said, give him a king. And the man that was chosen was Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. And Saul was a big man and a good warrior, but not a very good king. He didn't listen to Samuel when Samuel said, this is what the Lord requires of you about sacrifices and offerings and how you're to prepare yourself with prayer for battle. Saul didn't listen to Samuel. And so God told Samuel, I have rejected him as king. I'm going to pick a different king. And he sent Samuel to Bethlehem, where he went to the house of a man named Jesse, who had all these sons, and the youngest of the sons was David. And God told Samuel, anoint this boy David in the town of Bethlehem to be the next king. But it wasn't an immediate thing. He didn't immediately become king. He was a king in waiting. And so we have the story of David and Goliath, where David kills the Philistine giant. We have David coming into the court of Saul as a musician and then as a warrior and a leader of men. We have David becoming fast friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. We have David marrying one of Saul's daughters, Michal. But we hear about that the adulation surrounding David was so great that the women would sing songs and say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And this began to gall Saul, that he thought David was getting more praise and accolades than he was. And he, as the Bible says, cast a jealous eye on David. And that jealousy, that jealousy started to fester and grow. And Saul became less and less rational. And Saul became more obsessed with getting rid of David. And several times in a fit of anger and rage, he threw a spear at David. He told his son Jonathan that this man David is going to take the throne that belongs to you as the prince, as the rightful successor. This creates a huge tension in the family. And as we read about last week, it gets worse and worse and worse until at the end of chapter 20, it becomes clear that Saul is going to not rest until he has killed David. And so David flees from the court of Saul and runs away to save his life. And that's where we pick up now in chapter 21. And in chapter 21, it says that David, this is 21 verse 1, David went to Nob to Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech trembled when he met David and asked, why are you alone? Why is no one with you? So this is one of these, we're not sure if this is where the actual tabernacle was located at Nob. You know, the tabernacle is the temporary sanctuary that the Jews worshipped in from the time of Moses all the way until finally Solomon, David's son, built the great temple in Jerusalem. But in the meantime, they did not have a permanent place of worship. They had this tabernacle, which was a series of tents where they worshiped. But there were other places throughout Israel where there were high spots and high hills where they had worship. And there were still priests, the descendants of Aaron, brother of Moses, who would take the people's offerings and offer the animal sacrifices and wear the priestly clothing and follow the prescribed rituals that God had given Moses about how to worship. And so this place, Nob, was one of those worship places, and the priest there, one of the descendants of Aaron, is named Ahimelech, and David flees there, and Ahimelech is wondering why David, who all he knows is this is one of Saul's most trusted men and the king's son-in-law, why are you here? Why are you by yourself? And this is what David says in verse 2. David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.'" Now, we know from the previous chapters, none of this is true. David is on the run. He is not on a secret mission from the king. Everything he tells the priest is a lie. But he's telling him a lie because he's trying to save his own life. He has fled from Saul, and he makes up this story that he's on a mission from the king, but in reality, he's on the run, and he's now starving to death. He needs food. And he says, "Do you have some food? What else do you have that you can give me?" Verse 4, the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." Now, you might say, what is this all about? What does that mean? Well, if you go back to the book of Leviticus, matter of fact, if you want to look it up, it's Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 9. There in Leviticus 24, it lays out what is to happen during the times of worship in the tabernacle. And one of the things the priests were supposed to do every week was bake 12 loaves of bread and put them in front of the altar, put them there as an offering to God, a symbolic offering, and they were to stay there for 1 week, and then on the Sabbath, the priests were able to take that bread and use it to feed their families. It was part of their compensation as being priests. And only priests were allowed to eat that bread. It was holy bread, and a common person couldn't eat it. Only someone who was a priest could eat that bread. So here the priest says to David, "The only food I've got is bread, but it's not available for you to eat. It can only be eaten by a priest." Well, and he also says, and by the way, even we priests can't eat it if we have been near a woman. That would make us unclean if we'd been with a woman recently. So he says, "This bread is not for you." But David replies, talking about his men, that there are no men with him at the moment. He's there alone, but he has some followers apparently who are kind of scattered around. David replied, verse 5, 21:5, "Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" So the priest saying, well, this guy he's the son-in-law of the king. This is David who was the one who killed the giant. It says he gave him the bread. Verse 6, the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. So the priest breaks the rules, or at least bends the rules, and lets David have the bread. Now, this story is one of those stories in the Old Testament that then has a reference to this story all the way over in the New Testament. And if you want to turn over to Matthew 12, we find out that this episode from 1 Samuel is an episode that Jesus refers to in his ministry. Over in Matthew 12, we hear about Jesus and his disciples. And you'll see how this ties back to the passage from Samuel here in a minute. So Matthew chapter 12, starting at verse 1, it says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath.'" So Jesus and his disciples are traveling along. They come to a field with grain. They're walking through the grain field, and as they're going through the grain field, they're picking the heads of grain off of the stalks and popping the grains into their mouths. And it says the Pharisees says, you're breaking the law. And we might think, oh, they're breaking the law because they're stealing. They're stealing somebody else's grain. No, that's not what the problem is. As a matter of fact, it says in Deuteronomy, and again, we're jumping back now to Deuteronomy 23, verse 24. There was a rule. It says this in Deuteronomy 23:24. If you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in a basket. If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain. There was a rule in Judaism that if you were walking through someone else's field, of whether it's grapes or grain or anything else, you could pick and eat as you walked. Now, you couldn't put food in a basket, you couldn't gather it, but as you're simply walking through, you were allowed to pick anybody's grapes or grain. This was so that travelers would have some food. This is so the poor would have at least some ability to have something to eat. This was called gleaning. And the law laid out that you could do that. I said last night to our folks here in person, I can still remember as a child going to the grocery store with my grandfather. And I can still remember, he said, and whether he was right, I don't know, he said that at the grocery store, at least back in the 60s, if you wanted a grape, just pick one out of the produce aisle. You could eat a grape. You couldn't pick up the whole vine of grapes or the whole bunch of grapes, but if you wanted just a grape as you're walking through the grocery store, go ahead and eat it. Now, I don't know if my grandfather was right about that, if that was a simpler time, but I did it a few times. I wouldn't do it today, but it's kind of the same principle in some ways. In Judaism, you were okay to pick the grapes or pick the head of the grain. So Jesus and his disciples are doing that. They're picking the grains and popping them in their mouths. And the Pharisees say, aha, you are doing something illegal. But it's not because they were taking somebody else's food. What they say is, you're doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. You could do that. You could pick the grain or pick the grapes 6 days a week, but not on the Sabbath, because the Pharisees said that's harvesting. Even if you pick one grape, even if you pick off one head of grain, that's harvesting, and harvesting is work, and work is illegal on the Sabbath. You're breaking the Sabbath rules if you work on the Sabbath. And even picking one little head of grain or one little grape, that's work. Because this is how the Pharisees viewed the commandment to take a day off, rest on the seventh day, have a Sabbath. They had created an enormous number of rules defining what constituted work on the Sabbath. How many ounces you could carry, how many feet you could walk, whether or not you could start a fire, you couldn't, and on and on and on. All these incredibly picky rules that included now harvesting, and they said even picking one grape or one head of grain, that's harvesting. So they said to Jesus and his disciples, you're breaking the Sabbath. You say, what does that have to do with 1 Samuel? Listen to Jesus' response. Jesus says to the Pharisees, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day, and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, think about what Jesus is saying here. Excuse me. Jesus is saying, you are getting on my disciples' case for eating something that you say is work on the Sabbath. He says, what about the great King David? The great King David, he ate the consecrated bread. He ate the consecrated bread that no one except the priest was supposed to eat. And he and his friends ate this bread even though it was against the law. And then he says, think about what God has said to us over and over. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And what he meant by that, when God said that, he was talking about the rituals in the temple. the animal sacrifices. God was saying, rather than worry so much about making the ritualistic animal sacrifices, practice mercy, practice justice, practice righteousness. In other words, God is more concerned with our actions than he is with ritual. And he's more concerned with meeting human need than he is with ritual. Ritual has its place. we have rituals. So every time we have Holy Communion, we have a ritual. We have traditions. But Jesus is saying human need, human hunger trumps ritual. He says just like David's hunger trumped the rule against someone other than a priest eating the bread, so human hunger trumps your silly interpretation of the Sabbath laws, because God is more interested in human need and mercy and justice and righteousness than he is with following through with rituals, especially man-made rituals or man-made interpretations of the law. The reason I bring that up is if you were reading just the New Testament and you came across this passage from Matthew 12, and Jesus starts talking about David and the bread and all this, you'd go, what in the world is Jesus talking about? But because we study the Old Testament, in this case, the book of 1 Samuel, we understand the reference. And that happens all through the New Testament. There are all kinds of references in the New Testament that refer back to the Old Testament. And this is one of them. And so, because we now understand this story of David and the priest and the bread, the New Testament passage with Jesus makes sense. That's why I took such a detour to go over to Matthew. So now let's go back to 1 Samuel 21. And it says, so the priest gives David the bread, even though it was supposedly reserved just for priests. Then we're told in 21:7, now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg, the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. So hanging around this holy place where David gets the bread is a person who is a close associate and worker for Saul. And that's not good, and that's going to come back later in a bad way. So, now David, he's got bread, but he needs more. He says in verse 8, David asked Ahimelech, don't you have any spears or a sword here? I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's business was urgent. Again, David is bending the truth. He's not there on the king's business. He's running. He's running from the king. And the priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There's no sword here but that one. And this is, of course, a bit of really irony, that the only weapon at this holy place that has been placed there as a souvenir, as a symbol of God's victory, is the sword of Goliath, the very one that David killed. Matter of fact, we know from the story of David and Goliath, when David hit Goliath in the forehead with the rock from the slingshot, that didn't kill him. David ran to him as Goliath is laying there stunned. David grabbed Goliath's sword and cut off Goliath's head. So the sword of Goliath is the actual weapon that David used to kill Goliath. And here it is at Nob with the priest as a religious artifact. And when David says, I not only need some bread, I need a weapon. The priest says, well, the only weapon here is this prize, the sword of Goliath. David says, that'll work. And he takes that sword. He says, there's none like it. Give it to me. So now he's on the run. He's got some bread. He's got a sword. Now we find out David does something else kind of crazy. 21:10. That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. We hear that word Gath. Where have I heard the word Gath before? That's where Goliath was from. Goliath of Gath. Gath is a Philistine city. The enemies of Israel. David flees to a Philistine city, Gath. And it says there in verse 11, but the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Notice they've already calling David king, a little premature there. Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his tens of thousands. So they're like, wait a minute, isn't this our enemy? Isn't this the guy that killed our champion? What's he doing here? Verse 12. David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Now, you might say, what kind of strategy is this? David goes into the city of one of his enemies and then starts acting like a crazy man, like a madman, acting insane. Well, in the ancient world, when someone was clearly mad, when someone was clearly insane, ancient people thought the gods have done this to them. There's some weird way that the gods have gotten a hold of this person, and their mental state is something weird the gods are doing, and they tended to leave crazy people alone. Sometimes they might make them live away from everybody else, but they tended not to kill a crazy person. They tended to just say, that guy's crazy, we're not going to harm him, which is David's strategy to keep from being killed in the stronghold of his enemy. And Achish, the king of this city of Gath, his response is, to me, one of the funniest responses that we have in the Bible. It says, Achish said to his servants, "Look at this man, he's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring along this fellow to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?" I just think that's a really funny line. The king says, do I have a shortage of crazy people? Do I not have enough crazy people that you have to import crazy people? That we need more crazy people? Do I have a deficit of crazy people and you got to bring in, import in some more crazy people? I just think that's a really funny response that he says. And because David's drooling and foaming at the mouth and acting like a madman. But he doesn't stay there long. He just is there for a little while just to escape, get out the heat that's coming to him from Saul. Chapter 22. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. He's back in Israelite territory now. And remember, David is from the tribe of Judah. And Judah is the largest tribe with the largest amount of territory. So he gets back into the area of his home tribe. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. When David fled, he ran off to escape Saul. And I think we're to understand from context that maybe a handful of other people who were his loyal soldiers that were part of his elite sort of strike force may have gone with him. But word gets out that David is on the run, that David is now on the run from the king. And it says basically all kinds of malcontents and criminals and people who were in debt and people who didn't like Saul start to gather around David. We're like, oh, we don't like Saul. We don't like his taxes. We don't like working for him. We don't like what he's done to our country. All these sort of the opposition people start clinging and finding David and surrounding him. And now he's got 400 men with him. It's one thing to be on the run and hide when you're by yourself or with a handful of people. It's another thing to hide 400 people, 400 men. It gets harder and harder for them to find a place to hide. But now he's got 400 men with him. And it says in verse 3, 22:3, from there David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, "Would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?" First he went to the Philistine city, now he's going to Moab. And again, you think, why is he going to the Moabites? That's not part of Israel, and there have been times when the Israelites and the Moabites have been at odds with one another. Why would he go there? Well, again, if we think back and we remember some things about other books of the Bible, think about the book of Ruth. If you remember the book of Ruth, Ruth was from Moab. Ruth is a Moabitess who married a Jew, an Israelite. If you remember that story, Ruth marries an Israelite and her husband dies. And her father-in-law dies. And that leaves Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi says to Ruth, go back to Moab, back to your own people. And Ruth says no to Naomi, I want to stick with you. I want to go live in Israel. And so Naomi and Ruth go back to live in Israel. And if you remember, Ruth catches the eye of a distant relative by the name of Boaz. Long story short, she marries Boaz, and that's a love story in the Bible. Why is it in the Bible? Because Ruth is David's great-grandmother. Ruth is David's great-grandmother. So why would David say to his family, go hide out in Moab until the heat is off? Because David had family in Moab. His great-grandmother's family were all from Moab. So that's why he takes his family to live in Moab. So it says, so he left them, verse 4, left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. He knows that Saul is so unhinged that he's not going to only try to kill David, he might go after his whole family. And so David wants to put his family somewhere where they won't be killed by Saul. It says, but, verse 5, the prophet Gad said to David, David has a prophet traveling with him, don't stay in the stronghold, go into the land of Judah. David left and went to the forest of Herath. So he leaves Moab and goes back into Judah, which is the territory of his own tribe. Now, back to Saul. 22:6. Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and Saul, spear in hand, was seated under the tamarisk tree on the hill of Gibeah, and all his officials standing around him. And Saul said to them, listen, men of Benjamin. Remember, Saul is of a different tribe. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. He said, listen, men of Benjamin. Will the son of Jesse, remember that's David, David's father is Jesse. Will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you've all conspired against me? No one tells me when my own son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me as he does today. This is paranoia, again, turned up to an 11. He's speaking to his own kinsman. He's speaking to the tribe of Benjamin, and he says, has David promised you something? Has he promised to give you land? Has he promised to make you commanders of armies? Well, what's he promised you? Are you all turning against me? He then says, you must have turned against me. None of you told me my own son was conspiring with David. None of you told me my own son Jonathan was working with David against his own father. He's interpreting events always about paranoia, and everyone's against him. And he's saying this to his own close relatives and officials. But who else is there? This name I told you to remember, verse 9, Doeg the Edomite. Someone else who's from Edom, who was there. Remember, he was there at the holy place when David got the bread. Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech, that's the priest, son of Ahitub at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He gave him provisions and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So Doeg rats out David and rats out the priest that gave him the bread and the sword. He's like, this priest, he helped David. It says, then the king sent for the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and his father's whole family, who were the priests at Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, listen now, son of Ahitub. And the priest says, yes, my lord. Saul says to the priest, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of the Lord for him, so that he's rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today? Saul says to this priest, why are you a traitor? Why have you given aid to my enemy? Why have you given food and weapons to my enemy? And Ahimelech, the priest, answers very truthfully and honestly. He says, who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of the Lord for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant of any of his father's family, For your servant knows nothing about all this whole affair. The priest says, David came to me. He said he was there working for you. I believed him because he's married to your daughter. He's, as far as I know, the captain of your bodyguard. He's your most trusted soldier. He said he's there on official business for you, and I had no reason not to believe him. Yes, I inquired of the Lord for him. I've done that for you and your family many times. I don't know anything about this so-called rebellion. I don't know anything of what you're talking about. All I know is your son-in-law came to me and asked for help, and I gave it to him. We haven't done anything to wrong against you. We're not disloyal to you, King Saul. All that's true. But Saul won't hear it, won't hear this explanation. Verse 16, the king said, you will surely die. You will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family. Saul is so blinded by jealousy and paranoia, all he can see is you gave help to David, you're going to die. So it says, the king ordered the guards at his side, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they didn't tell me. None of that's true. But he orders his guards not only to kill this one priest, but to kill all the priests who worked at this holy place, all of them. He says to his officials, kill the priests. It says, but the king's officials were not willing to raise the hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Even his soldiers, even his bodyguards, when he said, kill all these priests, they're like, kill priests? They work for God, and we're supposed to just kill them right now on the spot? They're very hesitant to carry out this order. But, verse 18, the king ordered Doeg, the same guy who ratted out David, Doeg the Moabite, you turn and strike down the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck him down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. You know, the linen ephod is the priestly garb. He kills 85 priests. He doesn't even stop there. The next verse. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. He wipes out the entire town where the priests live, all because he's accusing them of being disloyal, which is totally wrong. This shows the depths to which Saul is now going in his insanity, his paranoia, his jealousy, his rage. He wipes out all these priests and their families and the whole town. But one priest escapes. Verse 20. Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, escaped and fled to join David. He told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul, I'm responsible for the death of your father's whole family. David realizes that him going to this priest and asking for food and a sword has now ultimately led to not only the death of that priest, but the death of that whole priest's family, the death of that entire village. And David says, it's my fault. Now, of course, we would say, well, actually, of course, it's Saul's fault. Saul is the one who killed them. Saul is the one who's crazy. Saul is the one who's bloodthirsty. But David can't help but think, if I hadn't gone there and drug this priest into my problem, he'd still be alive. So David feels remorse over what he has done. And he says to now the son of the priest that he went to, stay with me. This is verse 23. Stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who is seeking your life is seeking mine also. You'll be safe with me. So David takes this priest, the one who escaped the slaughter, and takes him now. And so now David has a prophet and a priest as part of his entourage. So now, keep going to chapter 23. Chapter 23, it says, David was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah. Keilah is a town in Judah. Are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors. He inquired of the Lord, saying, well, shall I go and attack these Philistines? So David finds out one of the towns of Judah is being attacked by Philistines. Remember, he's now got all these men with him, hiding from the king, but he hears about a town in his region that's being attacked by Philistines. He's like, should I go do something about it? And it says, the Lord answered him, "Go attack the Philistines and save Keilah." But David's men said to him, "Here in Judah we're afraid. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces?" Whereas his men are like, "Wait a minute. We're on the run from the king, and now you want us to go fight Philistines? Even if we defeat the Philistines, everybody will know we're there, and Saul will come and kill us, and we're on the run. We can't go fight the Philistines now." And so David, once again, it says, asked the Lord, again asking probably the prophet. Once again, David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, "Go down to Keilah. I'm going to give the Philistines into your hand." David's like, "Okay." So verse 5, David and his men went to Keilah, fought the Philistines, and carried off their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. Now, Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. Just telling us that the priest brought his priestly garments with him when he fled. David and his men go to this town. They defeat the Philistines. But now Saul knows where they are. Verse 7, Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, "God has handed him over to me, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars." Saul's like, "I got him now. We know right where he is. He's in a city with walls and gates. He won't be able to escape me. I've got him." And of course, Saul says, God has put him in, God has given me David now. He's interpreting the events as God is now showing him favor. Which, of course, all through the scriptures, we sometimes see people interpreting events. Well, God's doing this for me, and it's not always the case. So, verse 8, Saul called up his forces and said, "Go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men." When David learned that Saul was plotting against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod." And again, the ephod is not only a priestly garment, it was often used to try to determine the will of God. It was sometimes sort of almost like casting lots or throwing dice. And he said, David said, "O Lord, God of Israel, your servant has heard definitely that Saul plans to come to Keilah and destroy the town on account of me. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord, tell me." And the Lord said, "He will." Yes, Saul is coming. Excuse me. Saul is coming, and he's going to come just like we said. And then David says, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul?" Okay, David says, "Me and my men have just rescued this town. We've rescued them from the Philistines. So if Saul comes and says to the leaders of the town, 'Turn David over to me, turn David and his men over to me,' are the men of the town going to turn me over to Saul?" And the Lord says, "Yep, they will." Which you might say, he just saved the town. How can they turn their back on him and turn him over to death? Because the men of the town knew that if they said to Saul, "No, we're not going to turn him over," Saul would say, "Okay, you get to die with him," and would have had his men destroy the whole town. So the men of the town, he says, "Yep, they'll betray you. They'll turn you over to Saul." So verse 13, David and his men, about 600 in number, it's grown. It was 400, now it's 600, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told David had escaped from Keilah, he didn't go there. So David gets out of that town just in time to escape Saul. David stayed in the desert strongholds and in the hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. While David was in Horesh, in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. Saul couldn't find David, but his son Jonathan apparently knew how to find him. And so Jonathan finds David. And Jonathan says this to David, "Don't be afraid," he said. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horesh. So Jonathan comes to David, and he says, "Look, you're going to be the king. The handwriting's on the wall. We know you're going to be the king. And when you become king, I will be there for you. I will be second to you. I'll serve you. I'll be a part of your court. I will support you. This is coming from Jonathan, who is the crown prince, who, as his father keeps telling him, why do you support David? Because you should be the next king. You're the son of the king. You're in line to be the king. But Jonathan knows that's not God's will. Jonathan knows that God's will is for David to be the king. And he says, I'm loyal to you, David, and I'll stand with you, and I'll be second to you. And he says, I know you're going to be king, and as much as he hates to admit it, my father knows it too. He's denying it, but he knows that's what's going to happen. And he encourages David and leaves, and this is the last time these two best friends see each other. This is the last time they're together. The Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds of Haresh, on the hill of Hachilah, south of Jeshimon? Now, O king, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we'll be responsible for handing him over to the king. So once again, we have a group saying, we're going to get favor with the king by handing David over to him. Come on down. We'll help you catch him. And Saul replied, The Lord bless you for your concern for me. Go and make further preparations. Find out where David usually goes and who he's seen. They tell me he's very crafty. Find out about all the hiding places he uses and come back to me with definite information. Then I'll go with you. And if he's in the area, I'll track him down among all the clans of Judah. So Saul's like, finally, I got him. Finally, I've got people who are willing to show me where he's hiding. So they set out and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the desert of Maon, in the Arabah south of Jeshimon, and Saul and his men began the search. And when David was told about it, he went down to the rock and stayed in the desert of Maon. And when Saul heard this, he went to the desert of Maon in pursuit of him. He's closing in on him. He's getting closer and closer to David. Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side, hurrying to get away from Saul. And Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them. Verse 27, a messenger came to Saul saying, Come quickly, the Philistines are raiding the land. Right as Saul is about to close in on David, he gets a message. The Philistines are raiding us. The Philistines are attacking us. And Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. That's why they call this place Selah Hamaelkoth, which means the rock of parting. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Again, you say, well, a Philistine invasion saves David's life. Again, very ironic that it is an invasion of the Philistines that pulls Saul away just when he's about to capture David. Sometimes, we say, well, God works in mysterious ways. And sometimes it's all in the timing. And here, the Philistines invade at just the moment that would pull Saul off the trail of David. So one more chapter today, folks. Chapter 24. It says, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. So this area, En-Gedi, actually driven through En-Gedi on one of our trips to Israel. Lots of caves, lots of hidey holes. And it says, he meaning Saul, verse 3, he came to sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, without being too graphic, there's no porta potties there in this time. There's no public restrooms. There's no rest stops. And when you got to go, you got to go. And so Saul had to go, and he decided to do this in a cave. So he stepped into the cave to do his business. But we find out David and his men were far back in the cave. So the cave Saul goes into to take care of his business is the cave where David and his men are hiding, far back in the cave. And they can see Saul come into the cave and start doing what he has to do. And the men said, verse 4, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I'll give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" In other words, we've got him. He's helpless. He's in a very compromised position, and he's by himself. All we got to do is go up there and slit his throat. We got him. And David crept up unnoticed, and he doesn't kill him. David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Shows how close David got to Saul as Saul was taking care of his business. Cuts off a piece of Saul's robe and then creeps back into the darkness of the cave. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him. He is the anointed of the Lord." And with these words, David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. His men were saying, "You're never going to get a better opportunity to kill your enemy. You're never going to have another chance like this. He's alone and he's defenseless and he's clueless. And creep up there and stab him in the back. Creep up there and slit his throat." And David's like, "I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to kill the king. I'm no rebel." He says, "I feel guilty for even cutting off a piece of his robe." Why has he cut off a piece of his robe? Well, we're going to see in verse 8. David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say David is bent on harming you? This day you've seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I won't lift my hand against my master. He's the Lord's anointed. See, my father," remember, he's literally his father-in-law. "See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. Now understand and recognize that I'm not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I haven't wronged you, but you're hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you've done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds. So my hand will not touch you." It's like, Saul, my father-in-law, my king, God put you into my hands. I could have killed you. My men wanted me to kill you, but I didn't because I am not disloyal. I'm not trying to usurp your throne. I'm not starting a rebellion. I'm loyal to you. I don't know why you're trying to kill me. I am loyal to you. And he says in verse 14, "Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea?" David saying, "Who am I that you are marshaling thousands of men to hunt down? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand." Now, David makes this speech basically saying, why are you doing this? Whoever's told you that I'm disloyal, they're wrong. I'm not. You're my king. I don't know why you're trying to kill me. It says, when David finished saying this, Saul asked, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" And he wept aloud. "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You've just now told me of the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you didn't kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you'll surely be the king. The kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul, and Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Saul is moved by this. He is shocked, and he has a moment, you almost say a moment of clarity, a moment of rationality when he says, "You're more righteous than I am. You're right. God put me in your hands, and you spared my life." And who does that? Who spares their enemy's life? He says, I know you're going to be the king. I know that's what God has in store. I know you're going to be the king. He just says, but when you are the king, don't kill my whole family. When you're the king, don't wipe out my whole family. And David swears that he won't. And you might think, okay, well, they're reconciled, everything's hunky-dory, everything's fine, they've made up, everything can go back. No. David knows that Saul is a man who runs hot and cold. David knows that this is a man who is calm one minute and crazy the next. David knows that one minute he was throwing a spear and the next minute saying, here, take my daughter as your wife. David knows that he can't trust this moment of reconciliation or this moment of confession, this moment where Saul says, you're right, I'm wrong. He can't trust it. But at that moment, Saul at least decides to go back home. He can't bring himself to keep pursuing David at this moment. So he goes back home. David stays in the wilderness with his men. And unfortunately, this cat and mouse game, this duel between the king and David is not over. We're not going to see it. This is not the end of the story. We have more of Saul's irrational behavior. We have more of God protecting David. And all through this, as the author shows us, time and time again, every time you think David is about to get caught, every time you think David is about to die, every time you think Saul's just about to get him, something happens, and David is spared. Because God has already said, David, you're going to be the king. And we know God is going to make sure that happens. Now, David has to take some initiative himself. David can't just be passive about that. But God has already said this is what's going to happen. He will be the king. And we see God's protection of David. Even things like a Philistine invasion calling Saul off the trail. Other ways, the timing is always just right to protect David. David is not perfect. David endangers the life of these priests, and he regrets it. David lies when he has to. And when David lies, you realize, well, it's to protect his life. And we know that ethically we would say there are times when a lie, if it's to protect an innocent life, when the thief is at the door, when the Nazis are at the door, you lie. There are times when you can justify lying. And David lies multiple times to protect his life. But God protects him, and God watches over him. And we'll pick up next time with chapter 25 as we continue to look at the life and the ups and downs, the trials and tribulations, and ultimately the life of this man that the Bible calls the man after God's own heart. So join us next Wednesday. We think we'll have all the technology working well by then, so you can come join us in the sanctuary at 6:30. We'll be live streaming at 6:30 next Wednesday night. And we continue to learn how to use all this amazing new technology that's new to us and work out the kinks. So hope you catch this and watch this before next week, and hope you maybe pass it along to someone else that you might find would enjoy being a part of this study. We'll see you next time. God bless.